Just give people a few more seconds and then we'll get started. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. My name is Zach Pakin, and I'm a research fellow in the Canada's Role on the Global Stage program at IPD. It is a pleasure to welcome you today to this forward-looking discussion on how Russia's invasion of Ukraine is likely to affect how we think about questions of continental security in North America. We've got three excellent expert panelists who are joining us today to help us sift through the multiple dimensions of this question at this very important juncture in post-Cold War world history. But before we turn over to the discussion, I just wanted to let our audience know that one of our signature events at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, the Middle East Strategy Forum, MESF, is just around the corner, one of our two large annual conferences. This will be the second installment of MESF. It's just around the corner. It will be held on the 11th and 12th of May in person in Ottawa. If you'd like to find out more details about the conference, you can go to our website, which is peacediplomacy.org, and you can click the beautiful orange tab that says MESF on it, and you can check out our program and hopefully sign up and partake in the discussion with us. So thank you again to all of the members of the audience who've joined us today. It's now my pleasure to welcome here to you our three expert panelists who are with us. Major General Ian Huddleston, who is the Chief of Staff of the Canadian Joint Operations Command Headquarters at the Canadian Armed Forces. General, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a privilege to have you with us.
Thanks, Zach.
Thank you. Paul Whitney Lackenbauer is Professor and Canada Research Chair at Trent University, as well as the Network Lead of the North American and Arctic Defense and Security Network. Whitney, thank you so much for joining us as well. And
great to be here, Zach.
Last but not least, we've got Rob Hubert, who is an associate professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Calgary. Rob, thank you very much for being with us as well today. General, we're going to start with you, if you don't mind. If you could just help our audience to understand, what is the primary military threat to North America today, and has it changed at all as a result of the war in Ukraine?
Well, Zach, thanks very much. I think the primary threat has morphed somewhat from what it used to be during the Cold War, where we were talking about primarily long-range bombers, flying over North America and dropping bombs physically onto targets. That evolved into longer-range missile systems, where the bombers were able to launch those missiles from our north, or geographically from the northern or the extremities of our continent. And now it's evolved even further to where modern weapon systems possessed both by Russia, China, and to a lesser extent North Korea are able to hold our continent at risk from ranges at which we can't address those threats. So I think the threat is has remained reasonably constant in terms of what we could see other countries doing to North America in a conflict. It's morphed from being a single adversary to being at least two, possibly three, and they've extended the ranges and their capabilities, their precision, their stealth, if you will, the size, the radar cross section of their weapon systems, or the weapons that would fly in the air, to the extent that we're we're on our back foot. And I think, how has it changed? Most recently with the Ukraine situation, I think that has solidified what the militaries of both countries, U.S. and Canada, have been saying for a number of years now, that Russia is prepared to use their weapon systems in an aggressive and in that instance, an unprovoked manner. And so the threat risk is really a combination of capability and intent. And the Russians have just demonstrated that they have the intent to use the weapon systems that they've designed and built.
Got you. Thank you so much for helping us get this conversation kicked off. I'd like to just turn over to Whitney now and to center the conversation, at least for now, a little bit on the Arctic, which has to do with the following question. Even before cooperation in the Arctic Council was suspended recently, various branches of the US military were already busy modernizing their Arctic strategies, for example, and geopolitical competition was certainly present in the Arctic at that point in time. And that's probably the first way that Canadians tend to conceptualize any sort of threat to North America is in the Arctic. I think that maybe missiles being fired at Canadian cities is not the first thing that occurs to most people's mind. The Arctic is very central in the Canadian imaginary. So I'm wondering if geopolitical competition was already present in the Arctic prior to this war, has anything changed tangibly as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine as it relates to Canada's Arctic security? And was the region ever truly insulated from disputes in other theaters, as many people often claim that it was?
No, thanks. Important question. The way I love to conceptualize this is, what do we mean by Arctic security and what do we mean by Arctic threats? There have always been threats that would pass through or over the Arctic. So through the region, emanating from outside the region or say from Russian northern areas, parts of the Arctic zone of the Russian Federation, that would potentially pass over Canadian airspace or above Canadian airspace to strike at targets in the continental United States or in southern Canada. To me, that's an enduring set of risks, though as the general very importantly pointed out, those capabilities have been there. There have been changes in terms of the delivery systems. And certainly the leading edge delivery systems are ones that have those extended ranges, and we don't have defeat capabilities for at this particular stage, and potentially not even full suite of detection systems for those at this stage. Now the question becomes intent. Is there a greater likelihood that Russia may, as I think is the short-term competitor, who may escalate beyond ways that we were expecting even say 6 months ago, whether that the actual nature of the threat to the Arctic itself, which is a different category, and the Canadian Arctic in particular, in my mind, has not changed profoundly, not in the kinetic realm. So a fancy way of saying in terms of somebody delivering ordnance, bombing our Arctic, or coming and taking over a Canadian Arctic installation. Those kind of scenarios are possible in the case of a more general war, where we're going to have lots and lots of things to worry about, with the Arctic just being one of many, many ones. But the threats to the Arctic, I think, whereas the threats through the Arctic are more firmly tethered to technological advancement, I see the threats to the Arctic as somewhat related to technology, but a lot relating to climate change and environmental change. The possibility of increasing external access to our Arctic. We already see changing tempos and forms of activity within our Arctic, but not ones that I think are really pushing the threat threshold, as I would suggest. There are some risks, but we're imagining vulnerabilities that may be coming on board. I don't see these from a strictly Canadian Arctic lens as being fundamentally changed by what's gone on in Russia. And when it comes to changes within our Arctic space, so actually in our Arctic itself, these are enduring ones. They're relating to changing political conditions, economic conditions, but a lot relating to environmental change. And these are issues where I think there may be some vulnerabilities if we have adversaries deciding that below the threshold of armed conflict and working in non-traditional domains, the cyber domain, the information domain, the cognitive domain, we actually may see competition. Playing in, I said it would play within our Arctic, but it would actually come from outside the Arctic. And we may wish to chat about that later, how in a time of competition and conflict, we may see different patterns of activity below the threshold of armed conflict, really changing the forms of competition and potentially exposing some vulnerabilities and within the Canadian space.
Gotcha. Thank you. So we've touched on a couple of elements so far of continental security, the Arctic-specific lens, the non-Arctic-specific lens. Rob, I'm wondering if you could help our audience understand, in your view, with both of these lenses in mind, what must the government of Canada do that is essential for the defense of North America, and what are things that are more nice to have? We often see a criticism of the Trudeau government that it's not doing enough on foreign policy, on security and defense policy. So help us sort through these things. If there's a few targeted things that need to be done, what is essential more than anything else?
Well, the first thing, of course, that's probably the most challenging is the manner in which senior leadership thinks about the threat. Both the general and Whitney are absolutely right in terms of the identification of threats, but to make it as precise as possible, Canada faces two existential threats within its Arctic region. The one threat within the context of Canada, of course, is climate change. We know that that is coming. That is an existential threat to the existence of the Canadian North and for Canada in general. But we also know from everything that the general is saying that we now face an existential threat in terms of the changing geopolitical context. And let's be blunt, we're talking about nuclear war at the extreme level of what we're talking about. So the first thing that Canada needs to do is understand that it's a multi-level existential threat that we face. One of the greatest difficulties that we have in policymaking in Canada is we tend to have an either or. You're either going to try to figure out how to deal with climate change, or you're either going to try to handle the geopolitical side. And the real major challenge is that we need our political leadership to understand that you need to be thinking at a multi-level at this game. Now, let's start with what we need to do in response to the geopolitical context. Now, one thing I want to make very clear, this is something that the government's narrative is coming out, is that it now has to respond to a Ukrainian war that starts in February 2022. Let me be very explicit here, and this illustrates part of the difficulties of how governments think. The war started in March of 2014. We accept the Russian narrative that somehow the military involvement that they had in the Donbass and in Crimea was an annexation. We use different terms, but the war started in 2014. And to really get to the general's point, to understand the changing geopolitics of Russia means we got to look at 2008. That's the first time they used military force to stop a NATO membership. That was Georgia. That's also the time that they start introducing the development of many of these weapon systems that we are now seeing. So what does Canada have to do to respond to it beyond just thinking and understanding what the threat is? Well, the first thing is to recognize that in terms of what Putin has been telling us, and he's told us before the resumption of the conflict in 2022, is that we are now seeing a shift in terms of an understanding from nuclear deterrence, which was the understanding of how security was achieved in the Arctic region. We're now moving into the possibility of nuclear war fighting. And that means that Canada has to do whatever it can conceivably do to ensure that the cost of actually utilizing nuclear weapons in the many systems that General Hutchinson was talking about are not usable. In other words, we have to have a surveillance system. We have to make sure that the Russians know that even with the ultra-kinetic and hypersonic weapon systems that they're bringing onto the line, we will know that they come in and we have systems that are protected. The Russians also have to know that we are able to respond, not only in terms of knowing what they're doing, but actually defeat their systems. And so that means working really closely with the Americans in terms of giving not only a system of recognition for NORAD, which has been the traditional mission of knowing that a missile is going so that then Americans can threaten to fire and we have mutual suicide and therefore no one does it, that actually have the ability to engage with the Americans to know when these hypersonics and the underwater dimension to the Poseidon missiles and other parts that we haven't talked about, that the Russians know that they cannot win that. And it also can be extended to the future in terms of China. China needs to know that even if they bring in their Type 94 and 96 subs and give them an underwriting capability, that we are still able to detect and respond. And so we're entering into this era where the ability to convince China and Russia that a strike under any conditions is mutually suicidal is of critical importance. But, and this is the hard part for Canadian policymakers, We need to have that ability to fight. In fact, the Russians and the Chinese do not accept that. And we now have to accept that. Now, it leads to the other policy issue. We also have to figure out how we cooperate with the Russians and Chinese when we're trying to figure out how not to engage in mutual nuclear Armageddon with them. We need to figure out how we don't have a climate Armageddon. In other words, the real difficulty that we have right now is a conceptual. How do you negotiate with China and say, by the way, we are going to be able to defeat your weapon systems, but we need you to stop expanding your co-production. And so it's a conceptual issue in my mind that becomes the most important.
Well, for sure. And more than just a conceptual issue, it's very much a practical issue that needs to be addressed. And these may well, to a certain extent, be mutually exclusive goals, as you rightly highlight. So I'm wondering if I could just push back a little bit. I mean, obviously, the threat of nuclear Armageddon is undoubtedly of existential importance. But this language of calling Russia or China an existential threat, I mean, not only does it seem a little bit out of whack with the fact that Russia's having enough trouble with Ukraine, to say nothing of NATO as a whole, but is it not problematic to call these countries existential threats to us? I mean, that's the language that the U.S. has used vis-a-vis China, and that has certainly helped, the Sino-American relationship to descend to a level of profound mutual mistrust, where we're going to see strategic competition endure likely for decades at great peril to all of us. So if we want to de-escalate the situation and ensure our continental security, shouldn't we avoid language like that? Shouldn't we avoid conceptualizing the challenge of Russia and China as being existential, especially for a country like Canada?
Rob, do you mind if I jump in? I think the way Rob's framing this, though, in terms of the nuclear play, in my mind, I think that is the right language. Nuclear powers are, in my mind, by definition, existential threats. So from that standpoint, I think if we're going to operate on Rob's play on this, I mean, I might have a different read. I don't think that the likelihood of, what is being threatened by Lavrov irresponsibly in recent days is somehow negating the deterrence by punishment logic of mutually assured destruction that's been intact now for 75 years. I don't think that is being fundamentally changed. I think we're talking about playing a very, very dangerous game of suggesting that within a limited theater exchange, somehow Russia could deliver ordnance within Ukraine or neighboring countries, and that this wouldn't somehow escalate into more generalized nuclear war. In my mind, I think Russia is representing an existential threat with nuclear saber rattling, just like any country that's doing nuclear saber rattling represents an existential threat. Where I'm not sure it's helpful is if in blanket terms, we then only talk about different competitors as existential threats to one another, Zach, and I think that's where you're going, where that can actually lead to an escalatory ladder being climbed unintentionally, where there's no room to actually de-escalate. But I think within the nuclear space, I'm with Rob on this one, that we have to be taking this nuclear, brinksmanship, and I say manship because it is toxic masculinity the way it's playing out right now, and Putin in his inner circle, that this is truly existential and can't be anything but. But I think a lot of the issues and a lot of the competition that's going to be playing out is going to be below the nuclear threshold. It's going to be pan-domain. And that's where, in essence, we need to be very calibrated in some of our messaging and very clear about what constitutes red lines, because clearly those are going to be tested.
Understood. The general wanted to come in as well.
Yeah, well, we certainly don't see Russia moderating its language in the way that you're suggesting is necessary. In fact, they're doing exactly the opposite. They're the ones that are very specifically, multiple occasions over the last 2 months, threatening us with nuclear preparedness, the possibility of tit for tat attacks, all discounting the fact that their own attack of an invasion of Ukraine was unprovoked and entirely against the rules-based international order. So if we look at the example of our post-Cold War period, to a certain extent, we've enabled them to take these positions, and we've reduced our own deterrence by a lack of investment in the capabilities that both Whitney and Rob have suggested are required. We need, General Van Herk from NORAD often uses the term integrated deterrence, and what he's talking about is a whole of government approach. And I think although I'm no expert, loosely speaking, that would certainly include a focus on the environment and the existential threat that the environment poses. If we were to take a whole of government integrated deterrent approach, and what that means is that we're all of one mind. We create the capabilities that can both give us the necessary indications and warnings to combat their ability to surprise us, but also we get at some of the softer power efforts that you're suggesting, Zach, to deter them from the cost of attacking us. We don't have that right now. And Putin is threatening the use of tactical nuclear weapons, which, if we talk about the concern that we have on the continental defense side of the house, it's exactly that Russia would use either conventional or nuclear weapons to a limited degree in order to stop North America from reacting to actions that they're taking elsewhere. So they create a situation in North America where we cannot respond to other actions that they might take in the world. Now, of course, in the current situation, it's been the opposite. They've invaded Ukraine, but the difference being that Ukraine was not a NATO member. So there was no Article 5. There was no expectation on their part that we would push all of our forces over to Europe in the way that we would if we were defending a NATO colleague. But the similarities are there. And so the threat that you're talking about, and I fully agree with Whitney that it's not a threat to the Arctic. It's a threat to some of the infrastructure that's in the Arctic. For example, our radar systems, as old as they are, they're still a trip line. And so very much I could see a kinetic effect brought to bear on the Arctic in that fashion. But the cyber information and space domains are the three other domains where they can very much act, and almost with impunity. You see what they're doing with information. That's very clearly in the public. But optimistically, you also see how effective the Ukrainians have been in countering Russian disinformation, and also very much the UK. They're having true success when on every boardroom table you see the UK Defense Intelligence update on the current situation on the ground in Ukraine. We use those products ourselves. So that's been a huge success and a huge shift that I would argue that Canada needs to also be very involved in, beyond just the increased investment in indications and warning. But it's that integrated deterrence that's been worn away through our through the peace dividend. We've taken a peace dividend. That's a loose way of saying that we haven't invested properly in the defenses that we need, and certainly not in a comparable or relative manner to how the Russians and the Chinese, who are a competitor, we're not in a conflict with the Chinese, but they're certainly a competitor. And why would they design and be the leaders in hyperglide weapon systems if they were not trying to threaten other countries in some way, right? We have to focus on an integrated deterrence, and that's a whole of government approach.
Gotcha. Just to clarify a few things on this point. Yes, Rob, I'll come to you in just a second. Just on this point of the potential of tactical nuclear weapons being used in the context of the Ukrainian conflict, I'm not aware that escalate to de-escalate is a part of the Russian nuclear weapons doctrine, and I'm not sure that Russia's nuclear doctrine has explicitly evolved over the course of this conflict. And perhaps it should be remembered that just a few months ago, before the start of this conflict, all 5 official NPT members did sign a statement saying that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. So what precisely has changed as a result of a small theater war that makes us now believe that the president of Russia is prepared to risk a nuclear holocaust over something of such a minor scope? And more importantly, what is the logic precisely that involving deterrence that should affect Canada in this case? Why should we be threatening some sort of a response? Canada obviously not, but NATO as a collective whole. Should NATO be threatening a more significant collective nuclear response against against Russia in the event of, for example, first use, which is again not Russian doctrine as far as I'm aware, against Ukraine, for example, as unlikely as that might be? Does that not undermine North America's strategic splendid isolation to a certain extent? Rob, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I do.
Well, just first, I didn't suggest that we were going to strike them with nuclear weapons. I didn't say that, Zach. So you're kind of putting words in my mind, in my mouth. But they very much have threatened to use nuclear weapons in reaction to our activities. And Putin invaded Ukraine after saying multiple times that he wasn't going to do so. So I think some of your premise is wrong given the factual events.
Yeah, let me come in here, Zach, on three major points. I got to push back, first of all, and just saying that there's been an agreement of the non-proliferation countries. There was an agreement that Ukraine wouldn't be invaded. And we know how well Russia has followed that agreement. So I think that we have to be really careful about suggesting that just because there's an international agreement that Russia feels bound. Now, the other first factor is it picks on something that the general was saying. We have a tendency, we're just looking at Russia, and we see this in the government announcements coming out, not the military, but the governments, that, okay, so everything has changed from February 2022. And once again, even premise that Russia's doing so awful. Have a look at the way of Russia's way of war since 1999, when Putin comes in as acting president. We see a series of ways of war in which the Russians sacrifice their low-level troops always at the beginning. Look at the times that they took to suppress the Chechens, then to the Georgians, then to move into Syria to support the Syrian regime, and then to begin the Ukrainian war. There is a way of war that is very different from our way of war. And we have to be very careful before we say, oh, look at how terrible it's been in these first 3 months in terms of the restart of the war. That's how they did Georgia. That is how they did the Chechen wars. So be very careful on that. The second thing is capabilities. And once again, to emphasize what the general was saying, the Russians begin a change in terms of the delivery systems as early as 2004, 2003. We start seeing them developing their hypersonics. We see them starting to initiate the development of the Poseidon missile system. We see in terms of the marriage between the MiGs and the cruise missiles. In other words, they start looking and investing heavily. Remember, they're the fourth largest defense budget. So they're not an America or China by any stretch of the imagination. But they're very scarce resources to develop these weapon systems that are for fighting nuclear war. They're tactical wars. Look at the number of tactical weapons that the Russians now have today. According to SIPRI, probably about 2,000 out of their 6,000 arsenal. The Americans may be up to 1,000 at this point. It's always hard to know. And this comes into the second factor that makes this so complicated and makes it such an existential threat. This has not been happening in isolation. In other words, the Russians have not been using military force to extend their boundaries and developing these tactical nuclear weapons. The Americans, starting in 2016, began to respond. I've noticed that you're a very good student of policy and doctrine, and you're picking up on the policy to escalate, to de-escalate, and we can have all sorts of arguments whether or not that's official government. But have a look at the American policies that they start developing around 2016, 2017. Have a look at the fact that even go to the extent of putting tactical nuclear weapons in Ohio's. I mean, God, what does that say in terms of where the American mindset is? And so we need to understand this new environment that the Americans have picked up what the Russians are doing in intent and capability. They are quietly responding, and that means the environment is that much more dangerous for mistakes or even intent. And so to sort of push back and say, okay, how do we resolve? Remember, the Trudeau administration, after when the Ukrainian war starts in 2014, they reversed many of Harper's efforts to try to hold Russia to account. We now know that France and Germany did the same because they took the same assumptions that you bring forward, saying, okay, how do we calm things down? How do we work with the Russians? And I got to push back to you and say, Zach, how well did that work out for us? Did that really stop the Russians, when of course we re-welcomed the Russians back into the Arctic Council in 2015, when we canceled the radar sat imagery we were going to give the Ukrainians, when we said no lethal aid, just like the Germans did that really dissuade a regime that is intent on expansion? And so we have to look at what is the intent, what is the capability, and not what we wish it to be.
Understood. Okay, thanks very much for sharing that perspective. I want to bring in Whitney back into the conversation at this point on the question of ballistic missile defense. Do we think that this is something that Canada is going to have to revisit at this point in time? Because obviously part of the reason that the Martin government, I guess it must be more than 15 years ago now, resisted this notion of having a continental ballistic missile defense system in North America was to avoid Russia obtaining some sort of sense of siege mentality or encirclement. Canada has also regularly resisted, the Arctic becoming an issue on the NATO agenda. Obviously, we're in a very different environment right now. So I'm wondering if, the Martin government's position needs to be perhaps revised today. And do you think that Canada will have to eventually reconsider the decision that it took nearly 2 decades ago?
Yeah, Zach, I think it's a great question. I think it's one of the most central ones that the government's going to have to grapple with as it does this refresh on the defense policy, as the Prime Minister and the Minister have indicated over the last week and a half. So the simple answer is an unquestioned, unconditional yes. It has to be revisited. I think when we think back to national missile defense and the nature of the debates and how that was going to be destabilizing to international systems, potentially, and even the scale of that system to deal against, to be able to defeat what would be a rogue launch. What we're now seeing articulated in terms of layered ecosystems of defense and the very integrated systems that are being planned, and we see these articulated by the commander, US Northcom NORAD, are something quite substantively different than national missile defense. These are gesturing towards information dominance and theater dominance and potentially setting up a scale. So I think having an honest discussion about this and recognizing that if Canada is going to be a player and enjoy the benefits that we have had for 70 plus years within NORAD construct and continental defense constructs, the nature of our participation in missile defense, in my mind, within this construct of information dominance and sensor systems is already there. We may choose not to be investing in what the Americans would call kill systems, kinetic, for example, kill systems to go and take out a potential, delivery system that's flying over. We may choose that that's not within our political culture to do. But certainly the sensors that we are going to be investing in, and we've seen announcements from Minister Anand in the last few days, right, for over-the-horizon radar, that information, the data being collected is going to feed in to missile defense. So I guess what I'm suggesting is I think we're already inherently going to be there. It's now about having a discussion of what does our contribution look like? And then a very honest discussion with Canadians about our comfort level with contributing in certain ways. And by having that conversation, and I would argue by participating in it in an explicit way. So I guess I'm not being very, very coaching my position here to suggest I would like to see our role in missile defense articulated within whatever the defense policy refresh might look like. That it's also done in a way where we are going to be able to have some influence on strategic messaging, because we do bring certain equities and reputation to a table. And as a small to medium power, we can help to shape a space where maybe this isn't as inherently escalatory as some people were worried about back in that early 2000s debate. But General, I'd love to hear your comments on it. Obviously, you're not able to speak to government policy side of things, but just your thoughts on the missile debate.
For sure. We'll turn to the General on that front as well. And in addition to that, General, in addition to responding to Whitney's question, I'm wondering if you could also help the audience understand how Russia and China both figure into that question, and perhaps whether the two of them together represent a qualitatively different challenge for North American security than each of them alone, because obviously Russia's dependence on China is likely to accelerate as a result of this war.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I'll try it. I'm no expert on that particular point, but in terms of the weapon systems, I think the ballistic missile defense question has morphed dramatically, given that the systems that we're actually more concerned about are the small stealthy cruise missiles, high speed cruise missiles, and then now the hyperglide vehicles. So this is the tactical space that's in between Armageddon and peace, where weapon systems are being designed to hold us at risk below the threshold of nuclear Armageddon, because these weapons are all conventionally armed as well. They can be either conventionally armed or nuclear armed. They're very precise, and they can evade our defensive systems. So I think the ballistic missile defense discussion has very much morphed in the way that Whitney suggested. And our focal point, primary focal point with our continental defense discussions is on the indications and warning surveillance side of the house. But you'll note that the Future Fighter project has advanced another step recently, and the Future Fighter that's being considered as the primary candidate is very much capable of intercepting those small, stealthy cruise missiles if it's armed with the correct indications and warning, if it's vectored to the right location. So there is a defensive defeat aspect to our thinking as well, but I would hesitate to say that it's gone as far as to include ballistic missile defense, though we are considering integrated air defense requirements for critical infrastructure within Canada. So the two discussions are very much linked. Have they progressed to the point where there's a policy? No, but it's very much one of the significant issues that we need to address moving forward when we talk continental defense. In terms of the Russians and Chinese combining to create a larger threat, well, they haven't done so yet, but there's all sorts of reasons to think that the collaboration between Russia and China will become more direct and more involved over the next decade or two. And the Chinese systems and their technology is probably, I would say, more advanced than some of the systems that Russia has fielded. So if they've shown no intent, but if China were to combine with Russia in a scenario as you've suggested, then the threat would be hugely exponentially increased. But the answer is the same. The answer is integrated deterrence through information dominance, or through information. That's the key phrase, or the phrase that's being used. But it's indications and warning, pushing our awareness further away from the continent, right up to the shores potentially of China and Russia, so that we can. General Van Herk uses the left of launch discussion. So sometimes, and you've seen it used in the Ukraine, where we had indications and warnings that the Russians were going to do something, and our intelligence organizations turned very quickly to make that public information. And in my mind, simplistically speaking, it undermined the Russians' plans. And some of the plans that they had, which did not materialize, but which we felt were very viable and reasonable courses of action that they could take, were undermined by our very rapid and aggressive release of intelligence, where years past we would never have been so forthcoming with some of the intelligence that was shared. So that's an example. That's a good example of a current use of getting left of launch. So changing the calculus for the enemy by undermining what we believe their plans are, both through capability, messaging. Cyber can be part of it. Space. All of those things can contribute to heightening the cost that the adversary might see himself paying in a conflict.
Understood. Thank you so much, General. We've been spending most of the panel so far talking about adversarial intentions and capabilities. I'm wondering if we can shift in the final 20 minutes of our discussion now to questions surrounding theaters and bigger strategic questions that Canada now faces. And I'd like to turn to Rob to get us started off on this front. You've written in the past that Canada needs to get more serious about its alliance commitments, for example, in Europe and also in Asia. And I'm wondering if it can do that, in your view, while also getting serious about the defense of North America. That is to say, we have limited resources as a country. So do we need to direct them to a certain extent to more targeted goals and just be explicit about that and honest about that and say that our primary contribution, for example, to the transatlantic alliance, to NATO, will be to defend North America, which is equally a part of NATO as much as Europe is. Does that make sense at all?
It does and it doesn't, because the type of security environment we're going into, any effort to try to sort of factor out a niche capability and hope that that's the war that comes in your direction. Let's be very explicit. I think what all three of us are in agreement of is that the possibility of war is that much for real. We may differ on when that started, but the possibility of fighting. And so I think that the one thesis that Canada has had bilaterally or bipartisan, I should say, is that you need to be able to fight with the best. You need to have a fighting capability, not a constabulary capability. And you need to be able to move. And I mean, does that mean that we put everything into NORAD? Now, let me throw something else onto the plate that follows. Remember, we just recently had a budget, and go back to what we have. Our Minister of Finance has committed us to regime change. Once again, go to page 3 and 4 of her speech when Minister Freeland was saying, she says our security is not going to come until we vanquish Putin. She made it very explicit. So it's just simply, you know, both the General and Whitney have been talking about the need to and yourself too, to deter the Russians. She escalated. Now, one could argue this is just rhetoric, that it's just, you know, if she was hoping no one really picked up on it. I doubt that the Russians missed it. I doubt that the Chinese missed it, because she also says other dictators, which presumably means the Chinese, Iranians, and North Koreans. And so from a policy perspective, it's not just simply about government policy saying we're doing niche. She has said that for our ultimate security, we need to change these regimes. Now, once again, how far do we go? Now, the real kicker of what you ask, okay, we can turn around and say we absolutely need to defend North America. But we start looking in terms of the growing threat that China poses, because China is not a member of, we're not in any sort of alliance. And if anything, we're pulling away from the alliance that seems to be developing between the British, the Americans, and the Australians. And so I think if we really are going to take Minister Friedman's words to heart, one of the things that we have to do is this double down on our commitment to collective security. That means basically going along with what the NATO countries say we need to do to facilitate, which means a fighting capability. But we also have to start looking to the Asia Pacific region, which means that we have to reverse this policy of isolationism. And I'll be blunt. I've written on the fact that I see, looking to Asia Pacific, what Friedman says doesn't match up with what our actions have been. We seem to be pulling away. We need to, of course, be investing with our Asian colleagues. And I'll just end on one other point, just to put a note on how dangerous it's gotten, even on the ABM. Out of all of our NATO allies and our Asian friends, we are the only country that says we're not going with the American ABM system. And as the work of Jim Ferguson and Andrea Sharon and justify the Canadian commander of NORAD at Senate committees have made forward, the Americans are under no obligation. In fact, their officers under law cannot come to the defense of Canada. And I mean, of course, we assume that the Americans will see the defense of North America, even if we don't have a formal alliance. But man, oh man, when I hear Andrea and Jim going on this point that we cannot assume that, I get scared. So I come back to my point. We need to be reconfirming to back up what Minister Freeman says that we are now committed to. And that means as committed as can be politically with our allies and friends.
Gotcha. Thank you very much, Rob. We've got a variation actually on the same question that includes a specific proposal. And this is from Justin Massy, who is a professor at UQAM, as well as one of the two co-leaders of the Réseau d'analyse stratégique, or the Network for Strategic Analysis, which is funded by DND's MINDS program. And he asks a question, and I'll direct this to the general. Given Canada's limited defense budget and demography, would it not make sense for us to concentrate our money and personnel on detection rather than interception capabilities in North America, and keep some capacity for forward deployments in NATO and support to proxy wars overseas? Does that sound like a reasonable approach from your perspective?
Well, it's reasonable, but as with any military system, they're dual, triple, quadruple use. So the future fighter is not focused specifically on interceptions in Canada or over Canada or over the Arctic. It's very much the total number of fighters that we're purchasing, 88, is based on the commitments to NORAD and NATO being executed simultaneously. So we would have fighters, the designated number, available to support NATO operations, as well as the designated and required number of fighters to support defense of North America. So that's one point, and I think we have to have those capabilities. We can't focus on niches, and in my opinion, we can't focus on niches and still present ourselves as a first world, a G7 country and a key Five Eye ally. So we need the range of capabilities that address all of these concerns. But interestingly, I mean, to your point, we're finding innovative and imaginative ways to do better in the indications and warning space. The OTHR, the Arctic OTHR, over the horizon radar, is one example of that. That's an incredible capability that's going to change the dynamic of how we survey the North. And there's an integrated plan with NORAD, Northcom on building a system of those capabilities that will survey the space that's important to us. So, and we're working on cyber efforts, but very much on what's called by the Americans Joint All-Domain Command and Control. We call it Pan-Domain Command and Control, but irrespective of what it's called, what it is it's a coordinated way to collaborate, share intelligence, share indications and warnings, and then react using distributed IT systems. And we're very focused on improving in that regard and in maintaining the same similar interoperability with the US and our NATO allies. So I don't think we have a limited budget, yes, but I don't think one that you can successfully focus in on niches. And I think either Whitney or Rob said that. And I don't think we can afford to and remain seen and in reality be a true allied partner.
Gotcha. Thanks very much, General. Over to Whitney now, about one of the key strategic questions that Canadians have been wrestling with for some time, and that has to do with the future of our relationship with the United States. Obviously, the behavior and foreign policy of the United States is expected to differ in a world that is framed by great power competition, especially increasingly zero-sum great power competition, from the way that the US conducted its foreign policy, say, in the context of a unipolar world in which there was an unchallenged so-called liberal international order. So we're headed for a world now potentially where the US, and we're beginning to see this already, is not only interested in driving a hard bargain with its adversaries or potential adversaries, but may also drive a hard bargain in many respects with its own allies. So I'm wondering, in your view, how much is North American security and defense to be considered synonymous today with Canadian security and Canadian sovereignty? Does the logic of, for example, defense against help, does that still make a lot of sense in today's world?
Thanks. I don't want to slip into a 50-minute lecture on defense against help and its limitations. I mean, I think in essence, and I've written this, in a paper that came out a couple of years ago, refreshing something I'd done actually when I was a student of Professor Hubert's back in the day at the University of Calgary, suggesting I think that concept in a way has outlived its usefulness. We no longer need to defend against help the way we originally worried about that during the Cold War. And this was the idea that Canada had to mount sufficient defenses to make sure that we could reassure the Americans that we weren't going to be an easy access route for adversaries to hit at the US, and that if we failed to provide for our own defense, the United States might act against our interests to provide for its defenses regardless of our preferences, and therefore the United States itself might become a threat to our security. I don't think that's the case in the 2020s. I don't think that has been the case actually for the last 50 years. I think we get a lot out of this relationship. I think what's changed is now, in essence, when I hear both Rob and the general speaking, we're reinserting North American defense into our mix of where we need to be making strategic investments. I think that for the, arguably since 9/11, but even before, since the end of the Cold War, we've really almost taken for granted North American defense and security. Now, we thought about it in terms of threats within asymmetric threats, but in terms of this context of great power competition, I think now really registering this notion that certainly General O'Shaughnessy and now General Van Herk keep emphasizing the homeland is not a sanctuary. This holds true for the United States. It also holds true for Canada. So we're not inherently on different courses in this respect. I think in terms of how great power competition will play out internationally, there's going to be differences between Canadian and US contributions. We're not a superpower, and we don't aspire to be a superpower. I think that actually opens up very important space for us to be a very helpful ally amongst other members of NATO and other alliances, where I think there are going to be spaces for small to medium powers to play roles in ways that major powers cannot. And I think this is where having the right blend of investments into North American defense and those capabilities, as the general so succinctly put it, right, are also usable, deployable in many different contexts, including overseas, really is the right way now of thinking about this in a way that we can't take North America for granted. But at the same time, I don't think we want to go all in and thinking if we can say own Arctic defense and security or really contribute heavily to North American defense and security, then the Americans are going to be happy and sort of let us off the hook for thinking that we need to be contributing to global security. No. Those days never existed, and I don't think they're going to exist. We have a limited budget. Absolutely. It's a budget that we've seen indications is going to grow. And I just want these to be smart investments that are actually providing the right balance kind of portfolio where we contribute in many different ways, including in a more substantive way to North American defense in the face of evolving threats.
Gotcha. Thanks very much. Rob, could you help us understand the political dimension of this question to a certain extent? If disputes with the United States are likely to multiply, whether it's on trade or whether it's on different visions of regional order, say in Asia, for example, where we're a little bit more reluctant to call China, for example, an existential threat compared to what the United States has done. And even if we do invest more significantly in issues related to continental defense, but are still seen in some respects to be laggards, is there some chance or risk that these multiplying disputes with the United States, which may be inevitable, for political reasons, domestic political reasons, over the years and decades ahead, could that spill over into issues of continental defense, making it harder for us to work together on the areas where we actually do have to work together?
Well, the answer is simple, yes. And the major reason is we have to go back to the Trump administration. Now, there's still an ongoing discussion on terms of whether or not Trump was as bad as what his rhetoric was saying, whether or not Canada actually did okay once you got beyond the personality conflicts between him and the prime minister. But I think that the real issue that Canadian political elites are still coming to terms with is that the Trump administration introduced a new rhetoric. And the rhetoric is that Canada is one of many nations. Now, once again, we drill down to the senior military leadership, the political leadership that knows better. And once again, who is that nowadays when we look at some of the silliness coming out of the Senate? But the reality is that this rhetoric has now come forward that Canada is just one of other countries, even though, we can turn around and say, well, no, we are with you with North America. We share your interests. We share your economic concerns. But that rhetoric has been entrenched now. Now, is a Republican going to replace Biden that's going to return to that? Is Trump going to come back? And I think these are real questions that affect the political leadership and the political relationship that we have between us and the United States. And remember, the second part of that rhetoric is questioning of alliances. Now, in the face of the second phase of the Ukrainian war, that's being put on the side burners. But the reality is there are Republicans that firmly believe that the policies of isolationism is something that has to be revisited in terms of how they are going. And I dare say that a DeSantis or any of these other leaderships may in fact use that as a political tool, which is really a danger to Canada. Now, this leads to a point that Whitney raised so well, and that is, of course, going back and hearkening back to the defense against help. Part of that problem is that it has created a mindset amongst our political elites that we are still ultimately protected by what the Americans are to do because it's in the American interest to do so. Now, if we combine that with a United States that no longer thinks that Canada deserves any extra special protection in Mexico, and as much as we may turn around and say it's totally irrational to separate us from their ultimate defense, but we've seen irrationality does have a home in American policymaking. And so if we have all of a sudden this America that all of a sudden doesn't see as so important, we have a tradition not thinking serious about our own defense. In other words, we don't have the type of ability that Finland and Swedish leaders have shown their aptitude in the most post-recent events occurring. And so we need to recognize the Americans may disassociate themselves politically. And we need to have political leadership that can say, okay, now we actually got to think not just in what we can do to help the Americans so that we stay on their good sides, but what we actually have to do to keep to the security of Canada. And that's something we haven't shown very much capability of doing at the political level.
Gotcha. We've just got 5 minutes left, and I'm very sorry to the audience members whose questions we haven't been able to address. But if any one of our panelists would like to type in an answer at the final few minutes we've got left, I see that a couple of them are directed specifically to certain panelists, so do feel free. But we've just got time for one quick tour de table to figure out, what are we supposed to do? Very specific question. Short term and long term. So first of all, short term, what are the one or two most important things that we need to do right now on this front, right? So if it's a question of defense spending, how much? If it's a question of procurement, what's the one or two things that we really need right now, right? Or do we need less money and more money spent on diplomacy and other things? Feel free to make whatever case you like. And then the second question, of course, has to do with the long term, right? So what's our number one long term, in your view, challenge to continental security that we're going to be facing in North America? And what decisions do we need to be making, therefore, right now to ensure that we can address that long-term threat in tandem with other strategic imperatives that we might be facing? So that is to say, how does continental security, in your view, fit into Canada's overall longer-term grand strategy, to the extent that we can speak of such a grand strategy? So the short term and the long term. Let's start with Whitney, go over to Rob, and then we'll give the general the last word.
Great, thanks. Short term, sensors, more sensors, whole of government coordination across sensor systems, layered ecosystem. Let's figure out what that means. Let's invest. We've already seen some overtures that we're heading in that direction. And then secondly, let's carry through. I'll call it by the name that it is, the F-35. Let's see that through. Minister Anand has shown determination to make that a priority. And let's see that deal signed, because that gives us, as the general very succinctly put it again, it's not just an interceptor. It's not just an airframe, it's a sensor suite. It gives us a tremendous amount of capability. Long term, I'm going to keep it very general. It's about pan-domain resilience. And that resilience is whole of society. D&D plays a part, certainly within that, but it's respecting that the global political space is also changing. The nature of competition and conflict is inherently changing. And I think that means short-term investments, medium-term investments towards long-term resilience. We're talking cyber, we're talking cognitive, we're talking information domains, is where I would be putting a tremendous amount of intellectual resources as well as financial resources, and complementing a lot of the capabilities that we have or need to have renewed, but building us a new direction.
Thanks very much. Whitney, over to you, Rob.
Sure. We need to break this mindset that one act solves our problems, and it follows exactly what Whitney and the general is saying. The idea we go out and buy the F-35, and now we go on to other issues that are more important. We need to be like the Australians, like the Japanese, and recognize that defense decisions are a long-term systematic response. In other words, we just don't say, okay, we're going to throw a whole bunch of money here, and then, by the way, let's go talk about Alberta or Quebec politics. And so we have to somehow break that cycle at the political level. At the long term, I take my calling from the statements, or one might say rhetoric, that Minister Freeman has said, that in the long-term security of the Western alliance, Western system, is the ultimate defeat of the authoritative, aggressive states. In other words, she makes it very clear in terms of what the long-term threat to Western democracies and Canada are, and that is aggressive, expansionary, authoritarian states. And that she has made a call that we need to eliminate them to ensure our security. And I think that in the long term, Canada will need to figure out how it does that in a collective security environment in the European theater, but also in the Asia Pacific theater. So we need to take our call in the long-term solution.
Sounds like a monumental task indeed, and something that people of all stripes will certainly have to wrestle with, regardless of where they find themselves on the spectrum of restraint versus more hawkish approaches to foreign policy. So thanks for the food for thought, Rob. General, over to you.
Thanks, Zach. I hesitate to put this in the short-term category, but procurement. So we have to do better. We waste so much time, resources, both personnel and mental and financial. But in my mind, it's the personnel and mental waste that is most egregious. But in our procurement systems, we can't afford to buy major systems over the course of 20 years. We're seeing the Russians and Chinese both run rings around us in terms of the capabilities they're deploying on an almost weekly, monthly basis. We need to land the promised investment in continental defense based on the planning, the detailed planning that the CAF and other government departments have accomplished over the last months. And we need that investment. We need the plan to land soon so that we can start moving out. And then in the longer term, I think we very much lack a national security, a coherent national security strategy that involves the full use of all national elements of power to achieve our national goals. I think we don't. I say elements of national power. We're restricted by resources. We're restricted by money. We're restricted by capacity. But one of the best ways to get at some of those inefficiencies is to have a clear and concise national security strategy, which uses all those elements together to get at our aims, even if they're somewhat restricted aims because of our resource situation. And that national security strategy has to be very much complementary with those of our allies, particularly our key allies, the most key of which is the United States.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, General. And this has been a real treat talking to all three of you today. The Institute for Peace and Diplomacy is a think tank that tends to explore international questions using a lens of realism and restraint. It's very interesting to see how we explore that question from obviously a diplomatic perspective, from a more defense and military-oriented perspective, and when the imperatives of diplomacy and the imperatives of military affairs sometimes coincide, sometimes where they do not coincide and do not align, and in cases how they intersect, and how this should get us to reflect about bigger questions of Canadian strategy and the complex ways in which different imperatives that we face meld. So it's been a real pleasure getting to unpack this with you guys, and I'm sure there's a lot of food for thought that our audience is going to be wrestling with as a result of our conversation. So thank you to all three of you for unpacking this with us today. We hope to welcome you again to IPD. A reminder to our audience as well, just to check out our latest stuff online at peacediplomacy.org. And a reminder as well, our MESF is coming up, the Middle East Strategy Forum, next month, very soon. So please do check it out on our website. Thanks again for joining us. Merci beaucoup. Au revoir.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Dr. Bacon.
Thanks. Great panel.